Thank you, Dr. Korsved, and thank you, Paul Hawkshaw, for having me here. And it just dawned on me, I didn't include this in my paper, but Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation is magnum opus. He revised it 2 times. So there's another parallel there of Bruckner. But yeah, I'll go ahead and blitz through this. I kind of want to preface this that music and philosophy have always been kind of joined at the hip a little bit, like going back to Plato's Republic. Music is used as a synonym to describe justice and harmonizing the soul. And it's all throughout. Even the Phrygian mode is mentioned there as one of the ideal scales in music. But one of the most interesting aesthetic theories that I've come across is Arthur Schopenhauer's. And I do believe there's a great connection here with absolute music in terms of Anton Bruckner, so I'll be happy to read my paper in this regard. So, among the most influential aesthetic theories in the 19th century was Arthur Schopenhauer's account in The World as Will and Representation, which offered a powerful metaphysical justification for elevated status of absolute music. Schopenhauer drew heavily on Kant's philosophy, but diverged crucially in its aesthetics. Whereas Kant confined aesthetics to nature, Schopenhauer gave music metaphysical autonomy. For him, music does not represent the world of appearances. It expresses depth on par with the innermost essence of reality itself. Before turning to Schopenhauer's aesthetic theory, it is important to outline the metaphysical basis that underlies it. His famous opening claim, "The world is my representation," the first sentence in "The World as Will and Representation," indicates his continuation of Kant's transcendental idealism insofar as he accepts that the world of experience is conditioned by the forms of our cognition. What Kant called the realm of appearance.
A little slower, please, because this is hard to absorb.
I apologize. Yeah. What Kant called the realm of appearances corresponds to what Schopenhauer calls representation. Schopenhauer departs from Kant, however, on the nature of the noumenon, also known as the thing in itself. For Kant, the noumenon functions as an epistemic boundary of what we can know as rational people, whereas for Schopenhauer, it is recognized as the will, an insatiable, metaphysical, and universal drive that reveals itself most directly in our own experience of our own body's willing. The will becomes thus knowable through its objectifications by means of the eternal Platonic ideas, or universal archetypes, which function not unlike a metaphysical bridge between will and representation. These Platonic ideas are not bound to the principle of sufficient reason, which includes time, space, and causality, and applies only to particulars. Instead, the Platonic ideals stand as universal and eternal expressions of the singular metaphysical will. When the will appears under the conditions of time, space, and causality, the Platonic ideas become fragmented into individual phenomena, not unlike how Plato viewed particulars as imperfect instances of perfect universals. For Schopenhauer, this is the basis of the principle of individuation and why there's a plurality of phenomena that we experience as reality. Reality thus takes on its empirical character, and although it remains representation, it retains indisputable objective validity for Schopenhauer. Quote, "The perceived world in space and time, proclaiming itself as nothing but causality, is perfectly real and is absolutely what it appears to be. It appears wholly and without reserve as representation hanging together according to the law of causality." So that's setting the stage of why Schopenhauer's putting a lot of emphasis on the Platonic ideas and how it works into his aesthetic theory here. So for his aesthetic theory, as stated, Schopenhauer's philosophy places absolute music beyond the world of appearances into the realm of metaphysics. This sets it apart from other forms of art that depend on references to the phenomenal world. In regard to the visual arts, artistic geniuses perceive the Platonic ideas. Quote, "Genius consists in the ability to know, independently of the principle of sufficient reason, not individual things which have their existence only in relation, but the Platonic ideas of such things."
Excuse me, may I just interrupt for one moment? You mentioned the words Platonic ideas a couple of times.
Yes.
Could you just define that, please, what Platonic
Yes,
ideas are?
so one popular common knowledge of Schopenhauer's it's also synonymous with his forms. So Plato's forms and ideas are the same exact thing. Like there's a true or perfect archetype for phenomena. So one of the things in philosophy is arguing it's like about this table. Like, this is an imperfect table. It's not the ideal table. So it's more about the ideal aspect of something. And that for the idealist school of philosophy can turn into like universal principles. So it's more like a universal principle here that Schopenhauer is using. Does that help?
A little bit.
A little bit. All right. So just think universal archetype, and what we experience in the world of phenomena and experience is all imperfection. There's an ideal.
Is phenomena the same as experience?
Yes,
or
in this context.
Phenomena
Yes.
the same as reality?
Reality as we experience it. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. All right. So genius consists in the ability to know, independently of the principle of sufficient reason, which is essentially he reduces everything to causality, not individual things that have their existence only in relation, but the Platonic ideas of such things, and the ability to be, in the face of those, the correlative of the Platonic idea, and hence no longer the individual, but a pure subject of knowing. So in this context, what Schopenhauer is saying, that when you apprehend the universal archetypes, you're a pure subject of knowing, beyond the imperfections that we experience. And as geniuses in the arts that are able to really grasp that. Yet this ability must be inherent in all men in a lesser and different degree, as otherwise they would be just as incapable of enjoying works of art as of producing them. So the Platonic ideas are crucial to understanding Schopenhauer's hierarchy of aesthetics here. Architecture, according to Schopenhauer, is the lowest grade of the will's objectification by the way of the Platonic ideas due to its practical function more than high artistic expression. Horticulture stands slightly above it, though still quite insignificant, since though this form of art primarily relies on nature's natural beauty rather than artistic creativity. Sculpture holds a higher place because it expresses human beauty through grace, and humanity represents the highest grade of the will when shaped by the Platonic ideas. Its character embodies the Platonic idea of mankind. While Schopenhauer discusses various other arts, including poetry and paintings, which conjure reflections of the phenomenal world that partake in the Platonic ideas, his chief aim here, however, is to place absolute music in its own entire domain. While the visual arts are copies of the Platonic ideas, absolute music moves past the Platonic ideas altogether and becomes a direct copy of the will. Quote, music is by no means like the other arts, namely a copy of the Platonic ideas, but a copy of the will itself, the objectivity of which are the Platonic ideas. For this reason, the effect of music is so very much more powerful and penetrating than that of the other arts, for those speak only of the shadow, but music of the essence. End quote. One example of how absolute music bypasses the Platonic ideas is how we can listen to sorrowful music without experiencing actual sorrow, yet we fully comprehend that the music is indeed sorrowful, such as in the Phrygian mode that we discussed earlier today. Quote, music never causes us actual suffering, but it remains pleasant even in its most painful chords, and we would like to hear in its language the secret history of our own will and all its strivings and stirrings, with their many different delays, postponements, hindrances, afflictions, even in the most sorrowful melodies. Unquote. What music expresses reaches into something deeper and more immediate than the empirical objectifications of the will that are tethered to the Platonic ideas. So what I'm setting up here, music is different. It does not delve into the Platonic ideas that shape the visual arts, references to the phenomenal world. It's its own thing. And it's very important here for Schopenhauer. Through pure aesthetic contemplation, our ordinary desires and suffering fall away, and we enter a state in which the will is suspended, a state of temporary willlessness while our minds are absorbed by absolute music. To clarify, Schopenhauer unconditionally means absolute music. Quote, Far from being a mere aid to poetry, music is certainly an independent art. In fact, it is the most powerful of all the arts, and therefore it attains its ends entirely from its own resources. Just as certainly it does not require the words of a song or the action of an opera, unquote. When music is accompanied by words, such as an opera, pure aesthetic contemplation is somewhat compromised, since the listener is directed toward representations of the world of appearances, phenomena, experience. The metaphysical ideality of music is thus diminished as it becomes analogous with the empirical world where we are bound by our desires. The philosopher Gunther Zoller expounds on Schopenhauer's concept of absolute music, that it carries metaphysical weight, not unlike how we perceive the will and is most immediately in our own body's willing. Quote, absolute music is not expressed through representations, nor does it consist in representations that confront a subject with an object, as for example in the empirical cognition of individual things, or the non-empirical cognition of Platonic ideas in the other arts. Instead, according to Schopenhauer, we experience music and with it the will in a way that is not mediated by representation and hence is utterly immediate. This is an effective mode of experiencing that what Schopenhauer also claims exists in the inner experience of our own body as uniquely our own. The only composer Schopenhauer mentions by name in the world as will and representation, specifically found in the second volume, is Beethoven. Schopenhauer upholds that purely instrumental music, as found in Beethoven's first through eighth symphonies, not so much on the ninth, embodies what seems to be disorder, yet is sustained by underlying order, which transforms movements of vehement conflict into harmonious resolution. Beethoven's symphonies give full conduit to human emotions, but through only in an abstract manner, without specific material context. While we may feel compelled to imagine natural phenomena while listening to the symphonies of Beethoven, such an interpretation is arbitrary and leads to a distraction from the metaphysical potential. For Schopenhauer, the work is fully understood when received in its pure and immediate character, direct connection with music. Quote, now, if we cast a glance at purely instrumental music, a symphony of Beethoven presents us with the greatest confusion, which has yet the most perfect order as its foundation, with the most vehement conflict which is transformed the next moment into the most beautiful harmony. It is a true and complete picture of the nature of the world, which rolls on its boundless confusion of innumerable forms and maintains itself by a constant destruction. But at the same time, all the human passions and emotions speak from the symphony: joy, grief, love, hatred, terror, hope, and so on, in innumerable shades, yet all, as it were, only in the abstract without any particularization. It is the mere form without the material, like a mere spirit without matter. We certainly have an inclination to realize it while we listen, to clothe it in the imagination with flesh and bone, and to see in it all the different scenes of life and nature. On the whole, however, this does not promote an understanding or enjoyment of it, rather gives it a strange and arbitrary condition. It is therefore better to interpret it purely in its immediacy. So absolute music is very much supreme here for Schopenhauer. It is apparent that Schopenhauer is not referring to Beethoven's Sixth Symphony with its allusion to natural phenomena, and his Ninth Symphony with its humanistic lyrical Ode to Joy finale. Those references to the phenomenal world would detract from music's metaphysical potential. This is all building up to Bruckner, I promise. Anton Bruckner's Ninth Symphony exemplifies the Schopenhauerian aesthetic ideal in two principal respects: its extra musical context and the musical substance itself. From an extra musical standpoint, the fact that the symphony remains unfinished due to Bruckner's death in 1896 before the completion of the finale reflects Schopenhauer's metaphysical view that the will and existence itself constitute a blind striving without a noble conclusion or ultimate purpose. The work lacks conceptual purposiveness precisely because it lacks a conclusion, and this incompleteness mirrors the indeterminate character of the will. As famed musicologist William Carragan noted, The Ninth Symphony cannot be considered anything other than a work in progress. A work in progress may seem like an inadequate phrase because the symphony and how it exists in three complete movements without a complete finale is typically around an hour long. It is therefore often performed in concert halls as a single piece of complete music. However, the very fact that it is incomplete has caused a great deal of speculation and trouble. Because some fully orchestrated sketches of the finale fourth movement exist, many attempts at realizing a completion of Bruckner's Ninth have been made, with Carragan being one of those who developed a completion. According to Carragan, any attempt to complete the finale of Bruckner's Ninth Symphony must rely on the surviving sketches, yet it can never represent what Bruckner himself would have written. The extant material provides structure, sequence, and stylistic cues, but the final result would remain an interpretive reconstruction. Because Bruckner continuously revised his sketches and would have introduced innovations impossible to predict, any completion can only stand as an informed but ultimately subjective tribute to his intentions rather than an objective realization of the work that Bruckner would have produced. As such, the Ninth Symphony remains open-ended. Its incomplete state leaves the work without a definitive conclusion, which thereby reflects the indeterminate striving that Schopenhauer attributes to the all-encompassing metaphysical will. The Ninth also resonates with Schopenhauer's notion of absolute music as supreme, regardless of its status as a work in progress. It is widely regarded as a monumental achievement of absolute music, because Bruckner often adopted Beethoven's sonata form architecture and mirrored how Beethoven organized his own symphony's movements. It is reasonable to imagine that Schopenhauer would have responded favorably to the work in the context of its aesthetics, with music holding metaphysical weight. Moreover, although other composers adhered to the sonata form and produced highly expressive absolute music, such as Johannes Brahms, the Ninth Symphony is marked by an uncommonly lengthy passages of suspended harmony and vast spans of tension and release, which create the conditions for the listener to enter a state of pure aesthetic contemplation. In addition, the music of the Ninth gives rise to the perceptions of a spiritual or transcendent character, which is an attribute hardly ever associated with Brahms' symphonies. The first movement of Bruckner's Ninth invites the listener into a meditation of aesthetic contemplation in the opening bars where the string sections emerge slightly above silence. As the Latvian conductor Andris Nelsons puts it, at the outset of the piece, the tremolo in the strings is answered by the horns, informing us this is something important. From here, the movement unfolds in harmonic and contrapuntal complexity until it eventually reaches the coda, the summation at the end of the movement, which ties it into a grand bow. This coda specifically, with its master counterpoint, is often described by numerous admirers of Bruckner's music as ethereal or transcendent. This corresponds with the Austrian conductor Manfred Honig's notion that the conductor must evoke the spiritual and architectural dimension of the Ninth's music. The second movement, a scherzo of violent force, presents a world of insatiable rhythmic energy and dissonance. As American music critic Timothy Judd from the Listeners Club put it, scherzo translates to joke. But the terrifying scherzo Bruckner gives us is no joke. It's the furthest you can get from the folksy Austrian Landers of earlier symphonies. Instead, we get a blazingly ferocious demonic romp. This corresponds to how Schopenhauer viewed that Beethoven's music maintains itself by a constant destruction. Certainly, Schopenhauer would have had much to say about the violent power of the scherzo, as he admired the vehement conflict he perceived in Beethoven's music, which seems very tame in comparison with the intensities sometimes found in Bruckner's music. The third movement, an adagio which Bruckner called a farewell to life, is a very peculiar movement to end the symphony with. As music critic Timothy Judd again summarized, near the beginning of the adagio, we hear one of those climatic moments of sheer expansive majesty. The music which follows alternates between majestic grandeur and struggle. In the movement's ultimate climax, there is one final, ferocious eruption which breaks off with a jarring dissonance of a dominant 13th chord, not a 10th chord this time around. There is no objective resolution here, and because the fourth movement, the finale, only exists in some orchestrated sketches, The symphony ends in mystery. Some conductors prefer this mysterious aspect to the symphony. As conductor Christa Steeleman put it, there is mystery here, and we should leave it as it is. This also enhances the appeal of the ninth, regardless of if you guys like his conducting style or not. But he did say something that kind of resonates there, leaving the ninth unfinished. Bruckner's Ninth Symphony thus embodies the Schopenhauerian ideal in a twofold manner, both in the mystery of the work being a work in progress and in its musical content, which corresponds with Schopenhauer's espousal of Beethoven on multiple levels. This metaphysical ideal is realized in Bruckner's symphonies more than in the works of Richard Wagner, who, in following his conception of the total work of art, which was kind of influenced by Schopenhauer to some extent, permanently wrote operas rather than music for its own sake. In addition, Bruckner's symphonies succeed over the symphonies of Mahler's that include choruses, even though Mahler was greatly influenced by philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche. The inclusion of text in the music, even if philosophical, conjures reflections of the world of appearances and experience, and presents a limitation that diminishes the metaphysical potential of the music, which is an element that Bruckner's symphonies do not possess. As such, within Schopenhauer's aesthetics, Bruckner succeeds on par with Beethoven, and his Ninth Symphony may be the most potent example of this metaphysical ideal, both in its extra-musical and intra-musical dimensions.